Welcome to episode 24 of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Your new safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very, very seriously, but not too seriously. A bit of housekeeping. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is on the social medias. Please seek it out, follow, and like, and tell your friends. This Is Why I Don't Vote podcast is also on Patreon. If you like what you hear, please support the podcast financially. I've said it before and I will say it again. I want to escape the prison of my own design, the workaday world that I find myself in, and I want to retire and I want to mumble aimlessly into this microphone for your enjoyment, for your benefit. Make it financially viable for me to be your circus clown, for me to be the court's jester. Thank you for your support. On to the main attraction.
Act 1. I am an old and I am useless.
I want to grow the podcast and I want to quit my job and I want to just blather on aimlessly into this microphone for money for the rest of my life. Content creators, as the kids call themselves these days on the social medias, content creators have actually been very helpful to me in advising me how to do this. To the extent that I can, I have followed their advice. One of the things that I am told repeatedly is that you need to start threads, as they are called, on the social medias, thereby engaging your listeners. Under these threads, you may get other people who are not yet listening to the podcast. They will participate, and then they will go out and listen to the podcast. This is how you drive interest. Most of the people that listen to this podcast are people that I know. So if they have a comment, if they have input, they reach out to me directly. I am now asking many of these people, hey, can you post whatever your comment is to an actual thread? Can you email me? Can you otherwise engage the podcast via the social medias? One such listener reached out to me about my segment in the very first episode where I go on about how Little Caesars Pizza is in fact one of the most disgusting things that one could consume, and that an afternoon spent watching Detroit Lions football and eating Little Caesars Pizza would drive one to start considering the merits of communism. In reaching out to me personally, this listener explained to me the phenomenon of Little Caesars Pizza. Children. It's that simple. Little Caesars Pizza is cheap. You get a lot of it. You've got kids. You can feed the kids. Makes perfect sense. In a world where I'm trying to be more critical and not cynical, it makes perfect sense. Of course, the cynic in me is thinking, yes, look, children are grubby little heathens. They don't know any better. They will stuff that cardboard-style crap into their mouths without thinking and without consideration. No member of the household will want for food. In providing this succinct and this logical explanation to me, this listener reached out to me personally and I said, hey, if you could, engage the podcast. Post that to the Facebook, the Instagram, the Twitter, and I will react to it. And this way, I will be fulfilling one of the things that I need to do in order to grow the podcast. And of course, this listener came back to me and said, I'd love to. Hey, just show me how to do it. Send me a link because I'm not really familiar with that. I don't know how to do it. And you know what I said? I don't know how to do it either. I'm an old and I am useless.
Act 2. Life as a fan of the New York Metropolitans.
We all make decisions when we are young, decisions that we can't truly see how they're going to affect our lives in the future. These decisions are often passionate, emotional, devoid of the lessons of history, made without proper consideration of consequences. And yes, when those consequences manifest, as safe, secure, first world living individuals, we blame everybody else. We blame everything else. I don't deserve this. It's not my fault. Although this lament may be heard by a number of groups of individuals in the political sphere, in the social sphere, in the religious sphere. This lament is routinely heard in the sports world. No lamentation is more worthy of scorn, of laughter, of ridicule than that of the fan of the New York Metropolitans. We have choices in life, we make those choices, and we must live with the consequences, although the only way we really can do so is to blame everybody else and to blame everything else. But in the end, when it's dark at night, when you're laying your head down on the pillow, you know, God damn it, I fucked this up. As I have said in earlier podcasts, being a fan of the New York Metropolitans is like being in love with a beautiful, a classically attractive, and when I say classically, go look it up, consult your Google machine, attractive from a sense of proportionality, that anyone could look at the form and find that form attractive. It also includes a sense of elegance, often regal or having a cosmopolitan air. Being a fan of the New York Metropolitans is like falling in love with a beautiful, classically attractive stripper. That's right, stripper. Navigating the pole, casting out a net in a sea of ones, trying to get to the 20s, the 50s, the 100s. And what's worse, after having moved in with this classically attractive stripper, you find out that your neighbor, in love with an equally as beautiful and classically attractive woman, you find out that your neighbor is in a healthy, productive relationship with a successful, proud, dignified woman. Yes, like any relationship, there are bumps along the road. It's not a fairy tale every day, but your neighbor genuinely seems happy, and when your neighbor expresses to you any issues in that relationship, you think to yourself, first world problems. When you are a New York Metropolitans fan, you undoubtedly, because of your pettiness, because of the poor decisions that you've made in your life, because of the fact that you can't live in your misery alone, you have to see, hopefully, that your neighbor is suffering said misery as well. You can't help but look to see, how are the New York Yankees doing? And you are hard-pressed to find hard times in the Bronx. Hey, Bob, how was your weekend? Oh, you won't believe it. My beautiful, classically attractive lover that I dote on, that I adore, she went out and she took the kids to all the practices, and she also cooked all the meals for a weekend, and we had a date night on Saturday, and she coordinated the babysitter, and it all worked out well, and she had everything planned out. And oh, by the way, you know she runs her own business, and she just so happened to incorporate another business model into that business, generating a multitude of millions of dollars. And we're kind of wrestling now with the accounting and where's all this money going to go and how are we going to invest it? Yeah, it was a pretty good weekend. How about you? Oh, yeah, my weekend. You know, the beautiful, classically attractive stripper that I also love and that I also dote on? Well, I came home to find the kids completely in disarray. Turns out that she just left the house without telling anyone to go hook up with the guy that she's been friends with for 20 years. That friendship has always been questionable in my mind, but she says that it's just the easiest way for her to get the coke and the ecstasy and the quaaludes. And who am I to argue with that? You've got to be able to trust your drug dealer. Well, she ran out in the rented Ferrari that we had, and no one could find her for a couple of days. So I was up all weekend chasing after leads, and finally on Sunday I found her on the outskirts of town in a shady motel, and it turns out she had wrecked that rented Ferrari, and you know how it is. Maybe there's some legitimacy to those don't drink and drive commercials we see on TV all the time. Anywho, She missed both those shifts at the strip club this weekend, so she's going to have to find another place to work. And she'll probably have to drive all the way across town now because she's ruined her reputation with all the strip clubs on this side of town. And so I'll have to take a day or two off of work again, just to make sure that the kids are okay and that we take care of all the legal bills and that I make sure that the dealership doesn't file a lawsuit over that wrecked Ferrari. And you know how it is. Oh. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, man. Hey, have a great rest of your week. You know what? Thanks, Bob. You have a great rest of your week, too. You fucking asshole. And that's how it goes. That's how it goes as a fan of the New York Metropolitans. Now, is it Bob's fault? Is it your neighbor's fault that he made a wise decision? That he gave his heart to someone that deserved it? Someone that would actually warrant all of that attention, all of that love, all of that doting? In a perfect world, we would admire, we would emulate Bob. Man does good, gets rewarded, everyone's happy. But we do not live in a perfect world, do we, dear listener? As someone who is trying very hard to be less cynical, to be more critical, I want to feel good about the success of my neighbor. I want to learn from my mistakes, and I want to be better in the future. I want to cast out that classically attractive stripper. I want to sail my ship away from that siren song that I know leads to shipwreck. But I don't do it. There's always something to bring me back in. As of the date of this recording, the New York Metropolitans are in first place in the National League East. To many, an ignorant sports fan, that seems like a good thing. One of those ignorant sports fans, the current owner of the New York Mets, even went so far as to go on social media and chirp that he didn't hear any complaints now that the Mets were in first place. I have been living with a classically attractive stripper for 30 years. That she doesn't come home after being missing for 2 days with the stench of cinnamon whiskey on her breath and a handful of sweaty dollar bills. Well, I will not beat my chest. I will not speak boldly. I will not exclaim that all is right with the world and things are going to be different. Because I know. Oh, I know. We're only a few weeks away from that potential collapse. In looking critically at the New York Metropolitans, they are in first place in the National League East, and that should be celebrated. But when you look at the National League East, it can best be qualified, it can best be described as a dumpster fire. The New York Metropolitans are the only team above 500 in this division. What's more, the New York Metropolitans are 20-20 in said division. For the casual baseball fan or the person who is still listening to this, thankfully, and saying, damn it, when is this baseball segment going to be over? Bear with me, I will explain. 20-20 in the division means they've won 20 games against the division opponents, and they've lost 20 games against the division opponents. In a division where no other team is above 500, they are 500 against those baseball teams. How then are they in first place? Well, against the National League Central, another division within the National League, they are also at 500. They are 12-12. Curiously, against the National League West, the last division in the National League, and the best division in the National League, the New York Metropolitans are 14-6. They are 8 games above 500 against the National League West baseball teams. But upon closer examination of that statistic, really all the Metropolitans did was beat up on the Little Sisters of the Poor in that division, the Colorado Rockies and the Arizona Diamondbacks. 2 of the worst teams in all of baseball. Now, some Metropolitans fans will tell you, look, you have to play the teams that you have to play. You have to beat the teams on your schedule. This is very true. One cannot control the quality of the teams that they are playing. But having such a dark, scarred, ugly history with this classically attractive stripper, I know that there should be no bold talk, no proclamations about being in first place at the end of July. This is an average baseball team that just by way of scheduling has played two of the worst teams in baseball and has been able to rack up some wins and get well above 500 because of it. Should I be content that every night that this classically attractive stripper goes to work? Should I be content that the classically attractive stripper actually comes home with money, actually then leaves the next day and repeats as much? I'm content, but I'm certainly not happy. And unlike the hedge fund manager who speaks like a jackass on social media because a couple of things go well at one finite point in time, I'm just waiting for the bottom to fall out. I'm waiting to get that call that I've got to go bail her out of jail again for a public disturbance and for possession of cocaine and for drunken disorderly. And she'll cry and she'll promise to do better, and I'm so goddamn weak that I'm going to take her back in.
Act 3. The Simone Biles Situation.
As I stated in last week's podcast, episode number 23, I don't care about the Olympics. I really don't. But even someone that does not care about the Olympics is going to be made aware of the Simone Biles situation simply because of its proximity to the sports world. Can't escape it. If you've been living in a hole in the ground with a shadowy figure looming over you screaming, "It rubs the lotion on its skin or it gets the hose again," Simone Biles, Olympic gymnast, gold medalist, pulls out of an event basically citing mental health issues. Numerous commentators, numerous pundits go wild, go crazy, say outrageous things on the internet. These people, of course, are assholes. Let's be clear. No sports fan is going to care about what happened in the Summer Olympics in women's gymnastics 3 weeks into August when college football is starting. Outrage porn for outrage porn's sake. As I've discussed in prior podcasts, and as is typical in today's media landscape in the social media paradigm, yellow journalism prevails. It's all human interest, it's all sensationalism. There's rarely ever any substance in any of the discussions on any of the issues that are presented to us as news. Two issues immediately stood out to me about the Simone Biles situation, and neither of them are addressed in any substantive way in any of the news coverage. Simone Biles has ADHD and takes a medication in order to address as much. Although a mental health issue, and one that's probably something that she wanted to keep private, obviously the U.S. Olympic Committee knew this. Two issues being, one, what the hell is an Olympic gymnast doing on ADHD medication? And two, how did the U.S. Olympic Committee not know that this may be an issue going to the Olympics in Japan and didn't clear it well enough in advance that this would not affect the performance of this athlete? ADHD. In today's political and social climate, you cannot challenge conventional wisdom about mental health. But I'll say it right here and right now, dear listener. I don't understand ADHD, and when I say I don't understand it, it sounds like bullshit to me, no matter how well you dress it up. You are taking a child that is going through development, and you are giving that child extremely powerful psychotropic drugs in order to do what? To do what? I went to the CDC website in order to look up what is ADHD. What issue is the medical community trying to address with ADHD? ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. According to the CDC website, ADHD is one of the most common neurodevelopmental disorders of childhood. It is first diagnosed in childhood and often lasts into adulthood. Children with ADHD may have trouble paying attention, controlling impulsive behaviors, may act without thinking about what the result will be, or may be overly active. Signs and symptoms of ADHD. Again, this is on the CDC website. A child with ADHD might daydream a lot, forget or lose things a lot, squirm or fidget, talk too much, make careless mistakes or take unnecessary risks, have a hard time resisting temptation, have trouble taking turns, have difficulty getting along with others. That's the definition of childhood! That's the fucking definition of childhood! What kind of docile imbecile are they trying to create out of children that if you don't sit there and take what they give you in school, in church, at home, if you act like a child for any discernible period of time, they are going to take powerful psychotropic drugs and medicate you into submission. You have a high-performing Olympic athlete being placed on this medication. My first question was, how long has Simone Biles been on ADHD medication? When was she, quote-unquote, diagnosed? I mean, this is a girl that's probably thinking at age 12, at age 13, about gymnastics 99% of the time. And she's being challenged as much by coaches, by parents, by the infrastructure of this sport. You're asking a child to have the discipline of an adult based on the nature of this sport. If that child has a bad day, if that child is distracted, again, a child being distracted, if that child is distracted on any given day and doesn't have a good practice, that child may be subject to this diagnosis, to this medication. This is all speculation on my part because there's no information provided. And granted, based on her own mental health history, obviously these things are private. But this diagnosis in and of itself has always been questionable to me. You are basically identifying particular specific traits that are common amongst children and saying this is abnormal and we must give this child powerful psychotropic drugs in order to address it. This notion that somehow the scientific community can be certain about whether or not traits common to childhood would then persist into adulthood so that these traits must then be identified and medicated in childhood so that they won't persist into adulthood. That we as a public take as true that these medical professionals can qualify as much, can identify as much, can treat as much, is laughable. Look what's happened during this COVID pandemic. Should you wear a mask or should you not wear a mask? The very agency that is identifying what ADHD is, what its causes are, and what its solutions are, is an agency that can't tell its left from its right when it comes to whether or not we should be wearing masks indoors, whether or not we should be wearing masks outdoors. And if you know anything about these types of medications, you cannot simply go off one of these medications. You cannot simply stop cold turkey. They are extremely powerful psychotropic drugs. That brings me to my next point. Simone Biles goes to the Olympics in Japan. It's identified that she's taking this medication for ADHD. The Japanese say, no, you can't take it. She is still going to compete. We're not talking about months and months of preparation. We're not even talking about weeks of preparation. This girl is going to have to go off these drugs, or this drug in particular, cold turkey. She's going to have to immediately stop taking it. What do you think her mental condition is, having taken this drug likely for years and then having to go off of it cold turkey? And not only having to go off of it cold turkey, having to admit that she's on the medication for a condition and then having to perform and the biggest spotlight of her individual sporting career. Not only is she having to admit that she has ADHD, or at least she's been diagnosed with it, because again, I think it's bullshit in the first place. Not only does she have to admit that she's on a powerful psychotropic drug to address as much, she has to admit that she can't take that drug anymore, and that she is going to have to then go under the microscope of the Olympics under these conditions in order to compete. And then we as a public question the decisions that she's making specific to her lead up to these competitions. That brings me to my second point, the U.S. Olympic Committee. How the hell does the U.S. Olympic Committee not know that one of their athletes that's taking a prescription medication may be compromised in the Olympic event based on the fact that the home country does not allow for that medication to be taken for that diagnosis? How did the U.S. Olympic Committee not know? How did they leave that athlete so unprotected, so vulnerable? How did they not try to advocate that she have a waiver in this situation based on the fact that this is an Olympic competition? How was this not known? Moreover, how did they not advocate for her when she got there? In other words, the Japanese come and they say, she can't take this medication and compete. And the U.S. Olympic Committee is like, okay, yeah, she'll just stop taking it. And then when she starts to have the problems, the withdrawal symptoms, she's got cloudy thinking, she's not confident. Where is the U.S. Olympic Committee? Where are any of the people that involved in the infrastructure of U.S. gymnastics to help this girl? She's a kid. I believe she's 24 years old. The U.S. Olympic Committee completely drops the ball. U.S. gymnastics completely drops the ball and has no idea that this girl is going to be compromised in this competition because she's not going to be able to take a medication that very likely, based on the length, the duration of the time that she's been taking it, she's addicted to it. Now, none of these sexually repressed Puritans in the medical community want to admit as much, but when you give a child a powerful psychotropic drug very early on in their life, they're going to get addicted to it. Now, I don't want to get into a conspiracy theory. I do not want to discuss the fact that it's very likely that there are many in the medical profession who are well aware of the addictive properties of these drugs and don't mind giving them to children. I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of debating the rationale of that. What I do want to point out is the fact that this is a 24-year-old girl who was completely exposed by the U.S. Olympic Committee and U.S. Gymnastics and all of the pressure now for the decisions that she's making, having gone off a powerful psychotropic drug cold turkey, all of the weight of those decisions is falling on her. She was completely failed by the U.S. Olympic Committee. She was completely failed by U.S. Gymnastics. You can call the rule unfair if you want, but how did they not know? How did the U.S. Olympic Committee, how did U.S. Gymnastics not know that Japan would not allow Simone Biles to take this drug for ADHD while she's competing? How did they not know that? How did they not better advocate for this athlete once this knowledge came to light? Again, any of these pundits coming out and criticizing this girl, stupid assholes. And that just goes so far in the current media landscape, in the current social media landscape. Just being a stupid, ignorant asshole. My takeaway from all of this, I hope this girl can get off this medication and lead a healthy, productive adult life. Because she is not going to be able to do so addicted to some drug prescribed based off some bullshit diagnosis that's consistent not with anything but being a child. It's consistent not with anything more than the characteristics specific to being a child, no matter who you are. It's an unfortunate lesson that many adults have learned, and I know you have as well, dear listener, that many of the institutions that we rely upon, they're just going to let us down when we need them the most. Self-reliance isn't an ethos, it isn't a mantra, it's a necessity.
Act 4, Rise of the Superconference.
Texas and Oklahoma put the Big 12 on notice that they will not be extending their television rights in 2025 when the current television deal expires with the conference. Translation, as many a sports pundit has opined is that these two schools are going to leave the Big 12. Where are they going to go? Well, by way of geography, the closest conference would probably be the SEC. Of course, success, geography, none of these things matter in modern college sports. By way of television rights, by way of money for those television rights, the logical place to land for Texas and Oklahoma is the SEC. The Big 12 as a conference has had a number of successful teams in college football, in baseball, college baseball, in college basketball. I mean, Baylor just won the national championship in men's basketball. So it's not as if the conference is not competitive. This all boils down to money for television rights. As a fan of a team in the SEC, this does nothing but help the conference if, in fact, in 2025, both Texas and Oklahoma join the SEC. As someone who does not like the NCAA and thinks as a regulatory body it is filled with a bunch of deceitful boobs, overweight man-children spoiled by millions and millions of dollars of lucrative TV rights, well, this could be the death knell of the NCAA. Certainly, at least as it pertains to the NCAA's involvement in college football, whether that be its regulatory involvement, enforcing NCAA rules, whether it be for scheduling, whether it be for television rights. These potential super conferences simply won't need the NCAA. The NCAA will very likely continue to exist for smaller Division I schools and particularly for Division II and Division III schools, but it will not be a relevant body for these super conferences. Basically, if Oklahoma and Texas leave and go to the SEC from the Big 12, you will probably have 4 super conferences. You will have the Pac-12, you will have the Big 10, you will have the SEC, and you will have the ACC. Members of the extinct Big 12 will then be scrambling to join one of the super conferences. If geography is an indicator, and in reality it is not, but if geography is an indicator, some of those schools, like West Virginia, will be looking to join the ACC, while schools like Baylor, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, they're going to be trying to get into the SEC as well, or into the Pac-12. I have mixed feelings about this because I believe there are a lot of good things that can come from these super conferences and the emasculation of the NCAA, but I also believe there's a number of things that are going to be detrimental to overall college sports, and although fans don't see it, will be actually detrimental to fans' viewership of college football, of college basketball. So let's talk about the good. The advent of the super conference. You'll have maybe 20 teams in each one of these conferences, the SEC, the ACC, the Big 10, and the Pac-12. One of the things that they're going to be able to do is pay athletes. So they're going to be able to pay particularly their football players, particularly their basketball players. And that's not going to simply be paying them for their likeness rights in the event that they actually use their likeness. No, they're going to be paying all of their players. I am not against this. I think that for too long, major college sports has used up its college athletes with this facade of amateurism. It's complete and total bullshit. It's all nonsense. So these super conference teams are going to have the best athletes because they're going to have the best recruits and be able to pay them. That's going to mean that you're going to see fewer and fewer games from major conference teams where they're playing these small schools. These small schools are often receiving $500,000, $750,000, $1 million to play these larger schools. Playing a larger school for a team like Arkansas State or Southern Illinois, they can supplement their entire year's athletic budget by playing 1 or 2 teams in a year outside of their conference that is far outside of their level of quality on the field. Fans really don't care for those games anymore, but it's really lucrative for those smaller schools. So from a viewership standpoint, the fans are going to get more contests that are competitive, that are rivalry-based or at least conference-based, or it's going to be a major conference matchup with another conference. So you will have a team that's playing in a superconference with potentially 16, 18, 20 total teams. The entire conference schedule will be centered on that superconference and potentially 1 or 2 games with teams from another superconference. Those are a hell of a lot more compelling matchups over the course of a 12-game season. So the University of Tennessee playing Tennessee State, beating up on the Little Sisters of the Poor, you won't see that anymore. Compelling matchups in prime time. Must-see TV. Now, what else is good about the potential for these super conferences? Well, the NCAA goes the way of the dodo. And good riddance. Over the course of the last 10 years in particular, the NCAA could not have done any more to discredit itself with the casual fan, the diehard fan, the sports pundit. Their regulatory enforcement of their rules is absolutely corrupt. It's completely arbitrary. Its justification for the money that it brings in light of this argument of amateurism, is at best asinine. Again, at best asinine. At worst, these are morally and spiritually corrupt people. You create a super conference with the type of budgets that are commonplace with the University of Texas, the University of Oklahoma. You throw in Alabama, Texas A&M, Auburn, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida. You don't need an NCAA to coordinate events. You don't need an NCAA to enforce rules. You don't need an NCAA for anything. You certainly don't need an oversight body. You don't need an administrative body that's taking a cut of all the money that you're bringing in to do what? For most of these schools, to do nothing more than antagonize them. In my naivete, I look at this type of situation and I think to myself, if you had fewer hands in the pot, so to speak, if you have fewer hands in the pot that need to be fed from all this money, you may actually be able to create a television deal where football games go back to maybe 3 hours and 15 minutes. They're not so crammed full of ads because you don't have so many different mouths to feed. Again, I do not buy into this bullshit at all that the millennials, that the kids are ones with short attention spans, and that's the reason why television viewership of these games is dwindling, even attendance of these games is dwindling, even at major college football schools. No, that is not it at all. No one wants to go and spend 4 hours and 15 minutes watching a football game that has 1 hour and 18 minutes worth of content. Again, no one wants to go to a 4 hour and 15 minute football game that has 1 hour and 18 minutes worth of content. Anyone who went to college in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s who is now lamenting the viewership, the lack of attention from millennials, is of course an asshole. Plenty of them out there. Plenty of them out there. But I have a hard time believing that in 1967, if a football game took 4 hours and 15 minutes and you had 3 hours and 10 minutes worth of commercials, that attention would not wane. Again, I believe I'm being Pollyannish here, but I'm hopeful that new television deals with super conferences, again, less mouths to feed, potentially shorter football games with more content, it will drive back the interest that I believe rightfully should be there. Superfan drinks Kool-Aid, news at 11. But where are the negatives? Where are the negatives in this potential future super conference paradigm? Well, first and foremost, there's no more real upsets. When Tennessee plays the Little Sisters of the Poor, 9 times out of 10, no. 19 times out of 20, no. 99 times out of 100, probably, they're going to win. But every so often, you get that game where the smaller team beats the bigger, more established school, and it is a part of the sports landscape for the rest of that season. I can remember to this day watching the end of the Appalachian State-Michigan game where Appalachian State blocks the field goal that Michigan is kicking to go ahead in the last 10 seconds of the game. That is an iconic part of college football. The big schools are no longer going to play those smaller schools. There's no reason in a super conference paradigm for them to pay $1 million to some of these smaller schools to play them because A, they're not going to have enough room in their schedule to do it, and B, why are you going to take money that you could be spending on players that you want to pay so that you have a much better team? Why are you going to take that money and pay a smaller school to come play you? And that brings me to the next point. The major schools get all the best players. So you're not going to have as much diversity. You're not going to have as much competition throughout college sports because the schools that can pay the most are going to get the best athletes. They're going to have the best teams. So you're going to go back to the 1960s in men's college basketball. You're going to go back to the 80s and 90s in women's college basketball. You're going to go back to the 1950s and 60s and 70s in college football. You're going to go back to the consolidation of power, where there weren't that many schools that were competitive with the top 10 schools in the nation. Now, particular to college football, unfortunately, that's the environment we live in now. It's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. And it's very likely to infect college basketball as well. Amateurism will still exist because these smaller schools are going to then have to form their own conferences. They're going to have similar budgets and they're going to play one another. So you're still going to have amateurism in college sports. It's just going to be outside of the scope of very likely the 4 power conferences, the 4 super conferences. College athletic department budgets are driven by money. Of course, money. Can these schools with amateurism draw in enough fans, bring in enough viewers for television rights to support some of the smaller sports even within their own schools? Amateurism does not support women's field hockey in a place like Idaho. You are going to see a number of NCAA sports at some of these smaller schools just go away. They won't be able to afford it. Frighteningly for some of those alumni, those sports may actually be football and basketball, which are often the most expensive sports. The choice may be we're going to keep a number of what are traditionally smaller, non-lucrative sports, and we can do so because we're going to get rid of football and we're going to get rid of basketball. We're going to create and join a small conference based on geography so that travel is kept to a minimum and we can maintain our budgets. And that brings me to my last point. Part of the magic and the wonder of college sports is having big schools and small schools intertwined, competing with one another. You aren't going to see it anymore. What does that mean for viewership? What does that mean for fandom? Big schools not playing smaller schools, you're going to see these super conference schedules look more like NFL schedules, look more like NBA schedules. Athletes being paid, playing for all intents and purposes the same teams year in and year out. Truly, the disparity between the teams will become less and less and less, and football will look more like the NFL. Basketball will look more like the NBA. You may look at the results in week 8 of the NFL schedule and see that a team like Jacksonville upset Pittsburgh or upset Kansas City. And yes, that'll be a storyline for a night, but how big a deal is it? Worthy of only a raised eyebrow, and then you move on to the next story the next day. I fear that the passion for the sport overall will begin to dwindle. Boomers love their nostalgia. But what nostalgia will there be for the new graduates, for the millennials, in the new super conference paradigm? There really won't be any. College campuses themselves are losing a hell of a lot of their personality. You go to many of them and they are corporate. They are commercialized. They look like resorts. If you bring that type of corporate structure, if you flood these sports with money in the way that you have done with the professional leagues, do you really believe that the passion will still be there in 15 or 20 years? Do you believe it will be the same product in 15 or 20 years? We all lament how money ruins everything in sports. With the advent of the super conference, there's no way to get around it. Money will come in, and money may very well ruin college sports. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.